I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw my mother-in-law's smile that afternoon. It was too wide, too practiced, too perfectly timed with the way her eyes stayed cold and flat, like glass marbles pressed into dough. But I was exhausted, bone-deep tired from another sleepless night with my colicky baby and another argument with my husband about why his mother couldn't just stop dropping by unannounced. So I ignored my instincts. I walked through that front door anyway, carrying my diaper bag and my 3-month-old daughter strapped to my chest, and I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what they want you to think, isn't it? That you're overreacting. That you're the problem. That your gut feeling is just anxiety or postpartum hormones or some character flaw you need to fix. They gaslight you into doubting yourself until the moment you can't anymore. Until it's almost too late. If you're watching this from somewhere right now, anywhere in the world, drop a comment below and tell me where you are. Because I want you to know you're not alone in this. I want you to know that if you've ever felt like someone in your family was playing a game you didn't understand, you're not crazy. And if you stick with me through the story, you're going to see exactly what I mean. Make sure you check the description box below for more stories like this one. Stories about survival, betrayal, and what happens when you finally stop being the victim. My name is Jennifer. I'm 42 years old now, but this happened when I was 39, just 3 months after giving birth to my first and only child. My husband's name was Brian. We'd been married for 6 years at that point, together for 9. He was a good man in the ways that mattered on paper, steady job as an insurance adjuster, never missed a mortgage payment, didn't drink too much or gamble or cheat. But he had one fatal flaw that I didn't fully understand until it was too late. He worshipped his mother. Not loved. Worshipped. And his mother, Patricia, a woman with helmet hair the color of cheap champagne and a sugar-sweet southern accent that could cut glass, had decided from the moment she met me that I wasn't good enough for her son. The tea party wasn't my idea. It was never my idea. Patricia had called Brian 3 days earlier and told him she wanted to host a welcome baby gathering for our daughter Emma. She'd already missed the hospital visit because she claimed she had the flu, though I'd seen her Facebook photos from a casino weekend in Atlantic City the same week I was in labor. Brian had made excuses for her then, and he made excuses for her when she insisted this tea party happen at her house, on her terms, with her guest list. A guest list that included his Aunt Diane, his father's older sister, a woman who'd spent the last 3 months telling anyone who'd listened that I was doing everything wrong as a mother. Diane had opinions about everything. My decision to breastfeed was making the baby too dependent. My choice to co-sleep was dangerous and spoiling her. The fact that I'd gone back to work part-time after maternity leave meant I was prioritizing money over bonding. She never said these things to my face, of course. She said them to Patricia, who repeated them to Brian, who brought them home to me with this pained expression like he was just the messenger, and couldn't I please just try harder to get along with his family. So when we pulled up to Patricia's house that Saturday afternoon, a sprawling ranch-style home in the suburbs with a manicured lawn and garden gnomes that somehow looked judgmental, I knew I was walking into hostile territory. But I also knew I had no choice. Brian had begged me. He'd used words like important and family, and just this once, for Emma's sake. And I was so tired, so desperate to prove I could do this, could be the wife and mother everyone needed me to be. So I straightened my blouse, checked my reflection in the visor mirror, and plastered on my own fake smile. The house smelled like lavender and furniture polish, and something else I couldn't quite place, something medicinal and sharp underneath the floral scents, like the inside of a pharmacy mixed with potpourri. Patricia met us at the door wearing a pale pink cardigan set and pearls, her arms outstretched for Emma before I'd even crossed the threshold. I handed her over, because that's what you do, right? You let Grandma hold the baby. You play nice. You pretend everything is fine even when your skin is crawling with wrongness. Diane was already seated in the living room, perched on the edge of an overstuffed armchair with a teacup balanced on her knee. She was a tall woman, angular and severe, with iron-gray hair pulled back, so tight it looked painful. Her eyes scanned me up and down the moment I walked in, and I watched her mouth purse with disapproval at something, my shoes, maybe, or the stain on my shoulder from where Emma had spit up in the car. There were 3 other women there, too. Brian's cousin Leslie, who'd always been kind but distant. A neighbor of Patricia's, named Carol, who I'd met once at Christmas. And Patricia's sister-in-law, Judith, who nodded at me with the polite disinterest of someone who'd heard all about me and had already made up her mind. The room felt staged, like a set piece for a play I hadn't auditioned for. Everything was too perfect, too coordinated. The floral arrangements, the china, the way they were all positioned around the coffee table like they'd been waiting for me to arrive, so the real show could begin. Brian kissed me on the cheek and disappeared into the den with his father, leaving me alone with the women. Patricia settled Emma into a bassinet she'd set up by the window, one I'd never seen before, brand new with tags still attached, like she bought it just for this occasion, even though Emma already had a perfectly good bassinet at home. Then Patricia glided into the kitchen and returned moments later carrying a silver tray with a porcelain teapot and matching cups. Delicate, expensive-looking. The kind of tea set you only bring out when you're trying to prove something. She began pouring, moving around the circle with practiced grace, filling each cup with steaming amber liquid that smelled like chamomile and honey and something else. Something darker. More complex. A bitterness hiding underneath the sweetness. When she reached me, she paused, her smile widening into something that didn't reach her eyes. "I brewed this herbal blend especially for you, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "Thought you could use something calming after all those sleepless nights. You look absolutely exhausted." The words landed like a slap disguised as concern. I felt every woman in that room turn to look at me, assessing whether I did in fact look exhausted. Whether I was failing at motherhood already. Whether Patricia's observation was accurate or just cruelty dressed up as care. I took the cup from her hands, feeling its heat seep through the thin porcelain into my palms. The smell hit me again, stronger this time, now that it was right under my nose. Chamomile, yes. Honey, yes. But underneath, something medicinal. Something wrong. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and scream a warning I couldn't quite hear over the noise of my own desperation to be polite. "How lovely," I said, because that's what you say when your mother-in-law serves you tea even when every instinct in your body is telling you not to drink it. And that's when I made the decision that saved my life. The thing about survival instincts is that they operate faster than conscious thought. Your body knows before your brain catches up. Your hands move before you understand why. And in that moment, sitting in Patricia's pristine living room with a cup of suspicious tea growing cold between my palms, my body took over while my mind was still trying to be the good daughter-in-law. I lifted the cup toward my lips, watching Patricia watch me over the rim of her own teacup. Her eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that felt predatory, hungry, like she was waiting for something specific to happen. And that's when I noticed that her cup was different from mine. Same pattern, same design, but the liquid inside was lighter. Clearer. Just plain chamomile, probably. Nothing added. Nothing wrong. My hand trembled slightly, from exhaustion or fear or some combination of both, and I set the cup down on the saucer with a soft clink that seemed to echo too loud in the sudden silence. Because everyone had stopped talking. All 6 women were looking at me now, waiting. Even Leslie, who'd been chatting about her daughter's soccer tournament, had gone quiet mid-sentence. That's when Diane spoke up from her chair across the room, her voice sharp and nasal and dripping with barely concealed disdain. "Well, aren't you going to drink it? Patricia went to all the trouble of making that special blend for you. Least you could do was show some gratitude." She paused, then added with a sniff, "Though I suppose manners weren't something you learned growing up." The insult hung in the air like smoke. The other women shifted uncomfortably. Carol suddenly became very interested in her own teacup. Judith studied her fingernails, but Patricia's smile only widened, and I saw something flicker in her eyes that looked almost like triumph. Like Diane had just said exactly what Patricia had been thinking, but was too calculated to say out loud. And that's when everything clicked into place. This wasn't just a tea party. This was a performance. A test. Maybe something worse. And Diane, bitter, judgmental, cruel Diane who'd spent months undermining me to anyone who'd listen, was so focused on tearing me down that she hadn't noticed she was being used as a prop in whatever game Patricia was playing. If you've ever been in a moment where time seems to slow down and you suddenly see the whole chessboard instead of just your next move, you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever realized that the people you thought were separate problems were actually working together, intentionally or not, to destroy you, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happened next is something I need you to understand, not just hear. I picked up my teacup again. Slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone could see I was about to drink it. I brought it close to my face, inhaling deeply like I was savoring the aroma, and I watched Patricia lean forward slightly in her chair, her hands clasped together, so tightly her knuckles were white. Then I smiled, really smiled, the first genuine expression I'd allowed myself since walking through that door, and I stood up. "Diane, you're absolutely right," I said, my voice steady and sweet as poison honey. "Patricia did go to all this trouble, and I'm being terribly rude just sitting here. But you know what? You've been giving me so much wonderful advice about motherhood these past few months, about how I'm doing everything wrong, about how I need to learn from women with more experience." I walked across the room toward her chair, my heels clicking against Patricia's hardwood floors. Emma stirred slightly in her bassinet but didn't wake. The other women watched me like I was a bomb that might explode at any second. Diane's expression shifted from smug superiority to confusion, then to something that might have been alarm. I stopped directly in front of her chair, close enough to see the fine lines around her mouth, the way her hand tightened on her own teacup handle. Close enough to smell her perfume, something floral and old-fashioned that reminded me of funeral homes. "So I think it's only right," I continued, my voice never wavering, "that I defer to your wisdom. You should have this special blend Patricia made. Consider it a gift from one mother to another. Or, well, one mother to an aunt who seems to know more about my baby than I do." And before she could respond, before Patricia could intervene, before anyone could process what was happening, I reached down and smoothly switched our teacups. Mine for hers. The suspicious, bitter-smelling brew for her plain chamomile. Saucer and all. So quick and confident that for a split second, even I almost believed it was a genuine gesture of respect. Diane stared at the new cup in her hands like it was a snake that had suddenly appeared in her lap. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She looked to Patricia for guidance, and I watched my mother-in-law's face cycle through shock, rage, panic, and then something cold and calculating as she tried to figure out how to undo what I'd just done without revealing why it mattered so much. "Oh, that's not necessary," Patricia said, her voice strained, the southern sweetness cracking at the edges. "Jennifer, really, that was your cup. I made it specifically for you. The herbs I used, the proportions, they're meant for postpartum recovery. They won't be right for Diane." "Nonsense," I said brightly, settling back into my own seat with Diane's original cup now in my hands. I took a long, deliberate sip of the plain chamomile tea, never breaking eye contact with Patricia. It tasted exactly like regular tea. Clean, simple, safe. I'm sure Diane could use some relaxation too. She's been working so hard lately, giving me all that valuable feedback. Haven't you, Diane? Diane was still frozen, staring at the cup in her hands like it might bite her. The room had gone, so quiet I could hear the antique clock on the mantel ticking, counting down seconds that felt like hours. Carol coughed softly. Judith excused herself to use the bathroom. Leslie suddenly remembered she needed to make a phone call and disappeared into the hallway. Patricia's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, 2 spots of color high on her cheeks that looked almost feverish. She opened her mouth to say something else, but Diane, oblivious, entitled, cruel Diane cut her off. "Well, I suppose if you insist," she said primly, recovering some of her composure. She lifted the cup to her lips, and I saw Patricia's hand actually reach out as if to stop her, then fall back to her lap in defeat. "Though I still think it's odd to refuse a gift from your mother-in-law. But then, you've always been a bit odd, haven't you, Jennifer?" She drank. Not a sip, a full drink, like she was proving a point, like she was showing me how tea should be consumed by someone with proper breeding and manners. And I watched her swallow, watched her face register the same bitter undertaste I'd smelled, watched her nose wrinkle slightly before she smoothed her expression back into disapproval. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nothing happened. Patricia's hand was trembling so badly she had to set her own cup down on the coffee table. The china rattled against the wood. She stood abruptly, smoothing her cardigan with jerky movements that betrayed the panic I could see building behind her eyes. "I just remembered I have something on the stove," she announced to no one in particular, then fled to the kitchen without waiting for a response. Diane took another drink, smaller this time, then set the cup on the side table next to her chair. She launched into a story about her own daughter's childhood, how she'd done everything right, how children these days were being ruined by modern parenting techniques. Her voice filled the uncomfortable silence, and I let it wash over me without really listening, counting minutes now instead of seconds. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Emma woke up and started fussing, giving me an excuse to focus on her, to check her diaper and bounce her gently while keeping one eye on Diane. 20 minutes. 25. The woman was still talking, gesturing with her hands, completely fine except for a slight flush in her cheeks that might have just been from the warm tea and her own passionate opinions about childhood discipline. And that's when I started to wonder if I'd been wrong. If I'd let paranoia and exhaustion convince me of something that wasn't real. If I'd just committed some bizarre social violation for no reason, switching teacups with my husband's aunt like a paranoid, crazy person. Then, at exactly 30 minutes after she'd taken her first drink, Diane stopped mid-sentence. Her face went slack. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating until the gray iris was just a thin ring around bottomless black. And she said something that made every hair on my body stand on end. I can't feel my hands. Time has a strange way of stretching and compressing in crisis. The next 5 minutes felt like 5 hours and 5 seconds all at once. Diane's teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered against Patricia's hardwood floor, chamomile-colored liquid spreading across the wood in a pattern that looked almost like blood in the afternoon light. Carol screamed, a short, sharp sound that brought Brian and his father running from the den. Leslie reappeared in the doorway, phone still in hand, frozen in place. Diane tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She listed sideways in her chair like a ship taking on water, one hand clutching the armrest while the other hung limp and useless at her side. Her mouth was moving, but the words came out slurred and thick, like her tongue had suddenly become too large for her mouth. Can't feel what's happening, can't. Brian reached her first, grabbing her shoulders to keep her from sliding out of the chair completely. His face had gone white, eyes darting between his aunt and me like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't make sense. His father, a quiet man named Donald who I'd always liked, was already pulling out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed what I assumed was 911. Patricia materialized from the kitchen, and the look on her face was something I'll never forget. Not panic, not maternal concern for a family member in distress. Just cold, calculating assessment, like she was watching a science experiment go wrong and trying to figure out how to salvage the data. Our eyes met across the chaos of the living room, and in that moment I knew. I knew everything. I knew what had been in that tea. I knew who it had been meant for. And she knew that I knew. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes that felt like 12 years. The EMTs swarmed in with their equipment and their calm, professional questions. Blood pressure, heart rate, pupil response. They kept asking Diane what she'd consumed, and she kept trying to answer but couldn't form coherent words anymore. Her speech had deteriorated from slurred to almost incomprehensible, a garbled stream of syllables that might have been words or might have been panic-given voice. One of the EMTs, a young woman with kind eyes and dark hair pulled into a tight bun, picked up a shard of the broken teacup from the floor and sniffed it carefully. Her expression changed immediately, sharpened. She turned to her partner, an older man with gray at his temples and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen everything twice, and said something too quiet for me to hear. But I saw him nod, saw him pull out a different piece of equipment, saw the way both their demeanors shifted from urgent to something more cautious, more deliberate. They loaded Diane onto a gurney, still conscious but declining fast. Her eyes rolled around wildly, trying to focus on faces she couldn't quite process anymore. She was trying to say something, looking at Patricia, reaching out with one hand that someone had to gently push back down. The EMTs worked around her with efficient speed, asking questions no one seemed able to answer. That's when the kind-eyed EMT turned to the room at large and asked the question that changed everything. Who prepared the tea? The silence that followed was deafening. Brian's cousin Leslie looked at the floor. Carol had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Judith had come back from wherever she disappeared to and stood in the corner like she was trying to melt into the wallpaper. Brian looked at his mother, waiting for her to answer, his face a mask of confused concern. Patricia's smile returned, that same too wide, too practiced smile from when I'd first arrived. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest in a gesture that might have looked like prayer if you didn't know better. "I did," she said, her voice steady and sweet as Sunday morning. "Just a simple herbal blend. Chamomile, honey, some other natural ingredients for relaxation. I serve it to all the ladies. We've all been drinking it." She gestured vaguely at the various teacups scattered around the room, at the women who'd barely touched their own drinks and were now looking at them with new suspicion. "Ma'am," the EMT said carefully, professionally, "we're going to need to know exactly what was in that blend. All the ingredients. Your family member is showing signs of poisoning, possibly from a plant-based toxin or pharmaceutical adulterant. Do you have the tea leaves, the containers they came from?" I watched Patricia's mask slip for just a fraction of a second, watched something dark and desperate flash across her face before the smile reasserted itself, harder now, more brittle. "Poisoning? That's absurd. It's just herbal tea. I bought it at that organic market downtown. You know the one, Brian, where they have all the natural remedies. I've been drinking the same blend for years. There must be something else. Maybe Diane ate something before she came. Maybe she's having a reaction to medication." But the EMT wasn't buying it. I could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her eyes narrowed slightly. She'd seen through enough lies in her career to recognize the shape of a new one. "We'll need you to come to the hospital," she said, still professional but with an edge now. "The doctors will have questions, and someone should probably call the police. If there's a contaminated product that caused this, it needs to be reported." Police. The word dropped into the room like a grenade. Brian's father was already nodding, moving toward the kitchen where I assumed he'd make the call. Brian looked like he'd been struck, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and finally, the first flickering awareness that something wasn't right. That his perfect mother in her perfect house with her perfect smile might not be what he'd always believed. And Patricia was looking at me. Just me. Not Brian. Not the EMTs, not Diane being wheeled toward the door. Just me, holding my baby against my chest, standing in the wreckage of her carefully constructed afternoon. And the look in her eyes was pure hatred, cold and focused and absolutely certain of who had ruined everything. I should have been terrified. Part of me was. But there was another part, a part one hadn't known existed until that exact moment, that felt something else entirely. Something fierce and bright, and almost exhilarating. I had won. Without even knowing I was playing, I'd won. The ambulance took Diane away. Lights flashing but no sirens. They save those for when they're trying to beat the clock. And whatever was happening to Diane was already in motion, already beyond the point where speed would change the outcome. Patricia rode with her, practically dragged along by the EMTs who needed information she wouldn't willingly give. Brian followed in his car, taking his father with him, leaving me alone in the house with the other women who scattered like birds the moment the door closed. I stood in that living room for a long time, just breathing, just holding Emma. The broken teacup was still on the floor, the liquid dried to a sticky residue. The other cups sat abandoned on side tables, and the coffee table, evidence of an afternoon that had gone so spectacularly wrong. But then I started to notice other things. Small things. Wrong things. There was a mortar and pestle on the kitchen counter, partially hidden behind a canister of flour. When I looked inside, there was a fine powder residue, white tinged with green, and it smelled like the bitter undertone from the tea. Like medicine. Like something that shouldn't be in a kitchen at all. There was a book on the side table next to Patricia's favorite chair, spine cracked open to a page about medicinal herbs. My eyes caught on a passage about foxglove, beautiful, deadly foxglove with its bell-shaped flowers and its cardiac glycosides that could stop a heart or just make it beat wrong. About how the line between medicinal dose and lethal dose was thin as paper. And there, in the trash can under the sink, were empty capsules. The kind you can buy at health food stores to make your own supplements. Dozens of them, scattered among the coffee grounds and vegetable peelings like she'd been in a hurry to dispose of them and hadn't been careful enough. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and started taking pictures. Every angle of the mortar and pestle. The book with its damning page. The empty capsules. The kitchen counter where she prepared the tea. Because I knew, somewhere deep in my bones, in that same place where my survival instinct had told me not to drink, I knew this wasn't over. That Patricia wouldn't just accept defeat. That whatever was coming next would require proof, documentation, evidence that I wasn't the crazy daughter-in-law causing problems, but a woman who'd narrowly escaped being murdered by someone who was supposed to love her son enough to welcome his wife. By the time Brian came back 3 hours later, I'd photographed everything, sent the pictures to my own email, and put Emma down for a nap in her car seat, so she wouldn't have to be in that house any longer than necessary. He found me sitting on the couch, still holding my phone, staring at nothing. "She's in ICU," he said quietly, sinking into the chair across from me. His face was gray, exhausted, aged 10 years in an afternoon. "They're calling it cardiac arrest secondary to poisoning. They found, God, Jennifer, they found digitalis in her blood. From foxglove, in concentrations that," his voice cracked, "that could have killed her if she'd drunk more. If the EMTs had been slower." He looked up at me then, really looked at me for the first time since we'd arrived at his mother's house that morning. And I saw the question forming in his eyes before he even asked it. The terrible, dawning awareness of what it meant that I'd switched the cups, that I'd given Diane the tea meant for me. "Did you know?" he whispered. "Somehow did you know?" And that's the question I've been asking myself ever since, if you want to know the truth. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story gets even more complicated from here. Check the description below for more stories about family betrayal, about survival, about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you need protection from. Did I know? Or did I just get lucky? Did some part of my exhausted, anxious brain piece together all the small wrongnesses and make a split-second decision based on instinct? Or was I just paranoid and bitter and so determined to hurt someone who'd been hurting me that I acted out in a way that happened, purely by coincidence, to save my life? I still don't know the answer. But sitting in that living room with my husband staring at me like I was a stranger, I realized the answer didn't matter. Because Patricia had tried to kill me. Whether I'd consciously known it or not didn't change the fact that she'd ground up foxglove and put it in tea and smiled while she served it to me, planning to watch me sicken and maybe die while everyone thought it was just postpartum complications or bad luck or any of the 1,000 things that can go wrong with new mothers. And now, instead of me in that hospital bed, it was Diane. Bitter, cruel, judgmental Diane who'd spent months undermining me without realizing she was setting herself up as the perfect alternative victim. "Yes," I said, finally meeting Brian's eyes. Somehow I knew. The police detective who came to interview me was a woman in her mid-50s, named Sarah Bennett. She had short salt and pepper hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of direct gaze that made you want to tell the truth even if you'd been planning to lie. She sat across from me at my own kitchen table. We'd left Patricia's house and refused to go back, and asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. So I did. Every detail. The smell of the tea. The way Patricia had watched me. The synchronicity of Diane's cruelty giving me an excuse to make the switch. The kitchen evidence I'd photographed. All of it spilled out in a rush that left me breathless and shaking, while Brian sat beside me with his head in his hands and Emma slept peacefully in her bassinet, oblivious to the fact that her grandmother had tried to make her motherless. Detective Bennett listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook, her expression giving nothing away. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those sharp eyes. "You understand how this looks," she said finally, not unkindly. "From one perspective, you're a woman who just happened to avoid being poisoned because you had the presence of mind to switch cups. From another, you're a woman who deliberately gave poisoned tea to someone else, knowing what it would do." My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought of it that way. Hadn't considered that my survival instinct could be reframed as premeditated assault. Brian's head snapped up, his mouth opening to protest, but Detective Bennett held up a hand. "I said from one perspective," she continued. "But I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've learned to trust patterns. And the pattern here doesn't point to you. The preparation materials in your mother-in-law's kitchen. The book about medicinal herbs. The fact that Diane wasn't the one who prepared the tea, she was just collateral damage because you had the sense to protect yourself. She flipped through her notebook, found a page, and read, Patricia Holloway, 58 years old, retired nurse, access to medical knowledge and pharmaceutical materials, history of controlling behavior toward her son and previous daughters-in-law. Did you know Brian was married before? The world tilted sideways. I turned to Brian, who'd gone pale as milk, his hands trembling on the table. What? My voice came out barely above a whisper. Detective Bennett's expression softened with something that might have been pity. 5 years before he met you. Marriage lasted 18 months. Wife's name was Amy Sullivan. She left suddenly, filed for divorce, moved across the country. Never remarried. Never had children. When we contacted her this morning as part of the investigation, she said, and this is a direct quote, I always wondered if Patricia would eventually kill someone. I'm just glad it wasn't me. The room was spinning. I couldn't breathe. 5 years before me, there had been another woman who'd sat at Patricia's table, who'd tried to be a good daughter-in-law, who'd apparently seen or experienced something so terrible she'd run as far and fast as she could and never looked back. You didn't tell me, I said to Brian, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. Distant. Detached. 5 years. We've been together for 9 years, Brian. You were divorced for 4 years before we met, and you never once mentioned it. She made me promise, he said miserably, and I hated that even now, even after everything, he was still protecting his mother. After Amy left, Mom said the divorce was shameful, that it would hurt my reputation if people knew, that I should just put it behind me and start fresh. And God, Jennifer, I was so ashamed. Amy left because Mom made her life hell, and I didn't stop it. I didn't protect her. And then when I met you, I told myself it would be different, that I'd learned. But I didn't, did I? I just let it happen again. The detective closed her notebook with a soft snap that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Patricia Holloway has been arrested and charged with attempted murder. Whether the target was you or Diane will be up to the prosecutors to determine, but either way, the intent was there. The means was there. The evidence is overwhelming. She'll likely take a plea deal to avoid trial, but that's not my department. She stood, gathering her things, then paused at the door. Mrs. Holloway, Jennifer, you should know that Diane is expected to make a full recovery. She was lucky. The dose wasn't quite high enough, and the medical intervention was fast enough. She'll have some heart issues to monitor, but she'll live. After Detective Bennett left, Brian and I sat in silence for what felt like hours. Emma woke up and needed to be fed. I went through the motions automatically, diaper change, settling into the nursing chair, letting her latch while my mind processed everything that had happened. Everything I'd learned. Brian moved around the kitchen like a ghost, making tea neither of us would drink, putting dishes away, doing anything that didn't require him to look at me or speak to me or confront what his silence had cost. It was dark outside when I finally spoke. Did you know? That she was dangerous, I mean. That she'd done this before. No. His voice was raw, broken. I swear to God, Jennifer, I didn't know she tried to hurt Amy. I knew she didn't like her. I knew she made things difficult, but I thought it was just normal mother-in-law stuff. Criticism. Boundary issues. I never imagined. He stopped, shoulders shaking. How could I not have known? How could I have been so blind? Because you wanted to be, I thought but didn't say. Because it was easier to believe your mother was just difficult than to confront the possibility that she was dangerous. Because protecting her mattered more than protecting us. Over the following weeks, the full story came out in pieces. Patricia had indeed been a nurse, had worked in cardiology for 30 years before retiring. She knew exactly what foxglove could do, exactly how to extract the glycosides, exactly how much would sicken versus how much would kill. The prosecution's theory was that she'd intended to make me sick enough to seem like I was having postpartum complications, maybe a seizure or cardiac event that would be written off as one of those tragic things that sometimes happen to new mothers. Maybe not kill me outright, but weaken me enough that Brian would bring Emma to Patricia's house more often, let her help more, gradually push me out of my own family. Diane's inadvertent poisoning had ruined that plan spectacularly. There was no way to claim I'd had a tragic medical episode when someone else had consumed the poison instead, when the evidence was so clear, when the timing was so obvious. But here's what the prosecution didn't know, what no one knew except me, was that Patricia had been escalating for months. Small things I'd dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. The prenatal vitamins that had made me violently ill, the ones Patricia had recommended from her pharmacy. The herbal supplement she'd given me for morning sickness that had somehow made it worse. The special lotion for stretch marks that had left my skin burning and blistered until I'd stopped using it. I thought I was just sensitive, hormonal, overreacting to normal pregnancy discomforts. But sitting in the police station 3 weeks after the tea party, looking at Detective Bennett's files spread across the table, I realized I'd been a slow-motion target for months. Patricia had been testing me, testing dosages, testing delivery methods, learning what my body could tolerate and what it couldn't, building up to that final, carefully calibrated cup of tea. "You should testify," Detective Bennett told me. "The defense is going to try to paint this as an accident. A confused older woman who made a mistake with herbal remedies. Your testimony about the pattern of behavior would be crucial, but I didn't testify. Not because I was afraid, though I was. Not because I wanted to protect Patricia, though Brian begged me to consider how this would destroy what was left of his family. I didn't testify because Patricia took the plea deal. 20 years for attempted murder, eligible for parole in 12. She'd be 70 when she got out, if she got out. Old. Diminished. No longer a threat to anyone. The day she was sentenced, I went to visit Diane in the hospital. She'd been transferred out of ICU into a regular room, her color better, her speech back to normal, though she tired easily. When I walked through the door, I expected anger. Accusations. Blame for the fact that she'd ended up with poison meant for me. Instead, she looked at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Humility. Maybe even shame. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words seemed to cost her something. "For the way I treated you. For the things I said. I spent so much time criticizing your parenting, telling everyone you were doing it wrong, and I never once asked myself if I was being kind, if I was being helpful. I saw Patricia doing the same thing, tearing you down, and instead of defending you, I joined in. Because it was easier. Because it felt good to have someone to look down on." I sat in the chair beside her bed, not sure what to say. Emma was with a friend. I'd been afraid to bring her anywhere near Patricia's family, even the victims. "Patricia told me things," Diane continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "About you. About how you were isolating Brian from his family. How you were unstable. How you might hurt Emma if someone didn't intervene. And I believed her. God help me, I believed every word. Because it was easier than believing my sister-in-law was a monster. She told Brian the same things about me," I said softly. "That's how she works. She isolates her targets by making everyone around them doubt their reality, making everyone complicit in the abuse without even realizing it." Diane nodded slowly, tears tracking down her lined face. "When I woke up in the hospital and they told me what had happened, that you'd switched our cups, that the tea meant for you had nearly killed me, my first thought wasn't anger at you. It was relief. Because if you hadn't done that, you'd be dead. Emma would be motherless. And Patricia would have gotten away with it because everyone would have believed it was just postpartum complications. Just bad luck. Just one of those tragic things." We sat together in that hospital room for over an hour, and for the first time since I joined Brian's family, I felt like someone actually saw me. Not as a threat, not as a problem to be managed, just as a person who'd been trying to survive in a situation designed to destroy her. The divorce from Brian took 8 months to finalize. Not because it was complicated. We had a prenup, clear division of assets, shared custody of Emma that we both agreed to honor. It took 8 months because Brian kept hoping we could fix it, that therapy could heal what had been broken, that love could overcome the fact that he'd chosen his mother over me repeatedly until the moment she tried to murder me made the choice unavoidable. But some things can't be fixed. Some betrayals run too deep. And sitting across from him in the mediator's office, watching him sign the papers that would end our marriage, I felt nothing but a strange, hollow relief. I rebuilt my life slowly. Found a new apartment on the other side of town, close to a park where I could take Emma on walks without fear of running into anyone from Brian's family. Went back to work full-time at the marketing firm where I'd been employed before Emma was born, and discovered I was good at it, better than I'd remembered, now that I wasn't constantly exhausted from fighting invisible battles at home. Started therapy with a woman who specialized in family trauma and helped me understand that I hadn't been paranoid. That my instincts had been right all along, screaming warnings I'd been socialized to ignore. Emma thrived. She was 6 months old when the divorce was finalized, too young to remember the tea party, or the arrest, or the way her father had looked at me like I was a stranger in those first terrible days. She'd grow up knowing both her parents loved her, that we'd share holidays and birthdays and school events with the kind of civil cooperation that's possible when you both agree the marriage was a mistake but the child was a blessing. Brian married again 3 years later, a woman named Kate who was kind and sensible and had no illusions about who Patricia was. They had boundaries I'd never been allowed to have. Regular therapy sessions to process the trauma of having a mother who'd tried to kill someone. Limited contact with Patricia, who was still in prison and would be for years yet. As for me, I never remarried. Found contentment in being alone, in having control over my own space and time and choices. I dated occasionally, cautiously, always walking away the moment I sensed something off. My instincts had saved my life once. I trusted them now in ways I never had before. But here's what I think about. Sometimes, late at night when Emma is asleep and the apartment is quiet, I think about those 30 minutes between when Diane drank the tea and when the symptoms started. Those 30 minutes when I thought I'd been wrong. When I wondered if I'd let paranoia drive me to do something cruel and inexplicable to a woman who was just unpleasant, not dangerous. Those 30 minutes taught me something important. Sometimes you have to act on instinct before you have proof. Sometimes you have to trust that sick feeling in your stomach, that crawling sensation on your skin, even when everyone around you is saying you're overreacting. Because by the time you have proof, by the time everyone else believes you, it's often too late to save yourself. I think about Amy sometimes, too. Brian's first wife. The one who ran and never looked back. I found her on social media eventually. She lives in Oregon now, owns a bookstore, has cats instead of children. She never responded to my friend request, and I don't blame her. Why would she want a reminder of the worst period of her life? But I like to think that somewhere in Portland, she saw the news about Patricia's arrest and conviction and felt the same hollow relief I did. That vindication of finally being believed. The last time I saw Patricia was at her sentencing hearing. I sat in the back of the courtroom with Detective Bennett on one side and Diane on the other, strange allies united by the fact that we'd all survived her. Patricia looked smaller than I remembered, older, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the reality of consequences she'd probably never imagined facing. When the judge read the sentence, 20 years, she didn't cry or protest. She just looked back at the gallery, her eyes scanning the rows until they found me. And she smiled. That same too wide, too practiced smile from the tea party. The one that had never reached her eyes. The one that said she still thought she was smarter than all of us. That even from prison, she was somehow winning a game only she understood. I smiled back. Not a fake smile. Not a nervous smile. A real one. Genuine and fierce and full of the truth she couldn't stand to acknowledge. I had survived. I had won. I had protected my daughter and rebuilt my life and refused to let her destroy me the way she destroyed Amy and tried to destroy Diane. That smile was the last communication we ever had. Brian asked me once if I'd consider letting Patricia meet Emma when she eventually got out of prison. Assuming she lived that long, assuming parole, assuming Emma was old enough to understand the complicated history. I told him no. Not because I was afraid Patricia would try to hurt her physically, but because I knew exactly what Patricia would do. She'd smile that smile and say sweet things and slowly, carefully, systematically try to turn my daughter against me. She'd plant seeds of doubt. She'd criticize my parenting with concern in her voice. She'd do to Emma what she tried to do to me because people like Patricia don't change. They just find new targets. Emma is 7 now. She's smart and funny and fiercely independent in ways that remind me of myself before I met Brian. Before I learned to doubt my own instincts. She asks questions about Grandma Patricia sometimes. Brian has other family members, cousins and aunts who are normal and kind, and who Emma sees regularly, but his mother is conspicuously absent from family gatherings. I've told her age-appropriate versions of the truth. That Grandma Patricia made some very bad choices and hurt people, and she has to stay in a special place because of those choices. That sometimes people we love can do terrible things, and we have to love them from a distance to stay safe. That it's okay to have complicated feelings about family. That she should always trust her instincts, even when other people tell her she's wrong. Especially when other people tell her she's wrong. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, if you're still here, still listening, I want you to understand something. This isn't just a story about a mother-in-law who tried to poison her daughter-in-law. It's a story about how abuse hides in plain sight, how it wraps itself in love and concern and family loyalty, how it uses other people as weapons, how it gaslights you into doubting the very instincts that could save your life. And it's a story about survival, about that moment when you choose to trust yourself even when you have no proof, even when everyone thinks you're crazy, even when the choice might look cruel or wrong or inexplicable to everyone watching. I switched those teacups on instinct, on 39 years of accumulated life experience that had taught me to recognize danger even when it wore pearls and smiled sweetly, on 3 months of being slowly poisoned and told I was just sensitive, on 9 years of being with a man who loved his mother more than he loved the truth. And that instinct, that split-second decision that I still can't fully explain even to myself, saved my life. So if you're in a situation right now where something feels wrong but you can't quite name it, where people are telling you you're overreacting but your body is screaming danger, where you're starting to doubt your own reality because everyone else seems so certain of theirs, listen to yourself. Trust yourself. Get out. Get safe. Act on instinct even before you have proof, because by the time you have proof, it might be too late. Your life is worth more than being polite, worth more than keeping the peace, worth more than protecting people who are hurting you. I learned that the hard way. In a living room that smelled like lavender and poison, holding a teacup I knew I shouldn't drink, making a choice that looked crazy but turned out to be survival. And 7 years later, I'm here. I'm alive. I'm whole. I'm raising a daughter who'll grow up knowing that women don't have to shrink themselves to fit into families that don't want them. That survival isn't paranoia. That trusting yourself is the most powerful thing you can do. Thank you for listening to my story, for staying through all the complicated parts, for understanding that revenge isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's just about refusing to die when someone wants you to, about living well in spite of everything, about being the one who walks away instead of the one who gets carried out. If this story resonated with you, if you've been through something similar or you know someone who has, make sure you check the description box below. I've included resources for people dealing with family abuse, for women trying to leave dangerous situations, for anyone who needs help trusting their instincts again. And there are more stories there too. Stories of survival, of resilience, of people who refuse to let cruelty win. We're stronger than they think we are. We always have been. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply staying alive to tell the story.